Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's podcast, part of a series of podcasts that we're recording, looking into the impact of coronavirus on supply chains. Today, we're joined by Malcolm Harrison, Group CEO at CIPS, and Professor Richard Wilding, Fellow of CIPS, expert in logistics and supply chain strategy professor at Cranfield University. Welcome to you both.
G'day.
As we settle into and adjust to this new norm that the coronavirus has put upon us, many procurement leaders are also starting to think about what their teams and their strategy will look like post-COVID-19. There isn't going to be a flick of a switch and we all go back to how things were. So we must plan for the medium term as well as the long term and how we get back to some sense of normality. What impact this has on how we source, where we source, and the skills and the organisation of our teams is really something that procurement leaders will have to start focusing on. Will we need to adjust and reorganise teams to face different challenges? Will we need to change the direction or upskill our teams to remain fit for purpose? So that's what we'll be discussing today. The coronavirus has shone a light on supply chain vulnerability like we've never seen before. And although procurement teams are busy focusing on the here and now, like I say, this plans post-COVID, will we see a shift in the focus on our sourcing strategies going forward? One with more of a focus on risk and resilience rather than cost or value for money? And if so, what will the trade-offs be? How can you put a cost on resilience? Richard, if I could put that to you first.
I really think the soundbite around this is I see that what we're going to find is procurement for resilience rather than procurement for cost. But that's, of course, an incredibly simplistic statement. There are going to be multiple trade-offs taking place. However, what we've also got to recognise is we've got a number of trends which are taking place anyway, and this has created a burning platform for some of these to be implemented. So if I'm looking at supply chains at the moment, and we're looking at what we call, say, supply chain 4.0, some of the technologies that we're starting to see rolling out within certain environments are more or less enabling people to near shore and also maintain an equivalent cost. So I think we're going to see an acceleration of that. So that's going to mean, maybe more automation, robotics, and so on and so forth. And in a way, that is going to improve resilience anyway within the supply chain. So we're going to start to see this sort of change taking place. There's no doubt about that, this procurement for resilience rather than procurement for cost. But we're going to start seeing these shifts which are going to be taking place. I mean, that's really what we're going to start seeing. And I mean, we've already seen certain organizations doing this over the last 2 years, just saying, look, moving stuff around the world and everything else is becoming more challenging. Be it Donald Trump with, his sort of views on China, with Brexit and so on and so forth. All these things come together, which are creating, if you like, more uncertainty within supply chains. So things that we can do in that way just sort of help move it. So in the long term, I don't think that costs will be potentially any more than they are now. However, we're going to start to see some shifts in that, but we're going to see more resilience having to be built in.
And Malcolm, it's difficult to put a cost on resilience. And do you think organisations are ready to bite the bullet on what that might mean for holding more stocks or the cost of operating in that way?
Emma, I think I might answer that in a slightly different way. I mean, one of the things that I was certainly taught very early on in my procurement career was that the highest price you ever paid was when something didn't turn up, or when it did turn up but it didn't work. So that notion of continuity and consistency of supply being your first priority and price being the second priority, I think has always been one of the most fundamental principles. In fact, we may all remember people talking about the 5 rights. It's about the right quality, the right quantity, the right place, the right time, and the right price. And that notion of, look, if you worked in the manufacturing world, the worst thing you could ever do was shut the factory down. Because if you shut the factory down, then you lost sales and you lost customers. And that was clearly a price which was one you never wanted to pay. So to me, resilience has always been important. I think what's changed is that in recent years, and I'd agree with Richard, there has been an excessive focus on cost. And in some instances, what that's resulted in is people perhaps forgetting about some of those basic principles and the importance of resilience. So I actually think it's very difficult to put a cost on resilience until you run out. The factory shuts down. Then the cost is one that some say, well, that's a cost I don't want to have to bear. So I think going forward, I think what will happen is going to depend quite a lot by sector, and it's going to depend upon what the company appetite is for risk. Because if you start building in more resilience, then not always, but sometimes cost does come with that. And then it's about, well, what's the appetite of that company to bear that risk? And it's also about how good that company is at decision making. So interesting, you look at smaller companies, I think they're often better at taking faster decisions. I think they're often more agile. They have less focus on public reporting, but they don't necessarily have the scale and resources for large buyers. So yes, you are going to get differences by sector. You are going to get differences by company size. You are going to get different trade-offs. But in all of those instances, what you are going to need is people with the right skills to be able to put the right sourcing strategies in place for a particular set of circumstances.
And with so much focus potentially moving towards securing supply and managing risks, is there a potential that we're going to lose our focus on all the good work that we've been focusing on sustainability and social value agenda, for instance? How will we manage that balance?
Yeah, look, I think that is a risk. But on one hand, I'm very reassured by hearing from some companies and some leaders in procurement supply talking about the fact they're putting more focus on these important issues. Unfortunately, I've also heard others say that it may get deprioritized because there's so much else going on and so much else which is more immediate. So I agree with you. I think it is a risk. However, for me, and I think this is what the message I'd like to get across, and I welcome Richard's views on this, but for me, these are really important issues for society. Yeah. We've got to that environment where people are thinking about the company they work for, people are thinking about the brands, the products that they buy, investors are thinking about the company that they invest in, and that in part is about what is the approach that those companies are taking to really important societal issues like sustainability and like social value. So I don't think that is going to change. I actually could argue that some of the changes we may see in terms of reshoring or near sourcing might actually have quite positive impacts from both a sustainability and a social value perspective. Yeah.
However, Malcolm, I think one of the interesting challenges around this is that it can also have a negative impact on other societies. Just as a simple supply chain example, taking my world, if you think about, we're all doing at the moment, buying everything online delivery, basically research on home delivery. So if I look at the environmental impact of home delivery, it's actually really quite good. So you can have, if you've got a delivery van which is doing multiple drops. So I was chatting to my local delivery driver just yesterday, socially distanced, of course, and I said, well, how many drops are you doing a day at the moment? He says, well, I'm doing between 160 and 180 drops per day, right? Now, if you think about that, if I then offset the amount of CO2 that van is creating, it is far better for that home delivery to take place in terms of, say, CO2, the environment and everything else, than me getting in my car and driving to town. In fact, you can have up to 20 missed deliveries before the same amount is made. So great for the environment.
But it does depend upon them making multiple drops.
Yes, multiple drops.
What doesn't work is where they're coming out and making a specific drop.
So we've got that. However, let's think about this. So that's working very, very well. However, the next thing is so we're being good for the planet in terms of what's going on. Profitability. Now, that's another really interesting thing. So if I'm thinking about the profitability of home delivery, I can honestly say, if you're looking at, say, grocery delivery and everything else, we're already seeing during these COVID times, most companies have no idea about cost to serve. And what they're actually doing is they're saying, oh, yes, we're going to do home delivery, but then they're suddenly finding out they're actually losing money on this. So if you're looking at like online groceries, the jury's out still as to whether people are making any money on this. So if I'm looking at, the planet, great for the planet, profitability, not quite sure. But hang on a minute, let's just think about our society. So because I'm now getting everything home delivered, I don't go into my local town. Because I don't go into my local town, my local community is now being compromised, and therefore is dying down. So in a way, as consumers, doing our procurement, we also need to think through these things. And if we're moving, as we're finding, for example, with the nearshoring agenda, Nike announced just over a year ago that they were going to do some big, re-engineering of their supply chain. Great things, great for the environment, great for their costs as well, because they're saying they're not going to have to do duties. It was using small footprint manufacturing and all this type of thing. This was their vision of what they wanted to do. But one of the things they said is that we reckon we'll have half the people within this. If you go and look at their current supply chain actually employs 1 million people. So let's just take a really pessimistic view on this. That means that 500,000 people in Asia may now actually not be employed. Now, what does that mean then for society in the world? Potentially what that could mean is we get more civil unrest, we get more extremism, we get various other things taking place. And I think for procurement leaders, the challenge is where are those decisions actually taking place? Because if we've got, say, more junior people in the business making what are seen as really great decisions, which are saving loads of money for the organization, which is great, but is that social impact actually being factored into some of these procurement decisions? And I think that's going to be the interesting debate which is going to be taking place in the future.
These are very complex issues. Very complex issues. I think what you're highlighting there, Richard, is some examples of just how complex they are, and the fact that you can't take a decision in one part of a supply chain without understanding the impact on another part of the supply chain. And I think for me, the most important thing that comes out of this is these are organization-wide decisions. These are business decisions, and yes, procurement and supply chain professionals have an enormous bearing on that decision and making sure the right information is available to take that decision. But ultimately, it's much bigger than just being a narrow sourcing decision.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing. It's actually recognizing that these, you could argue, are more or less board level decisions. So then the skill sets required of the procurement professional is how can they talk the language of the board. And I think that's been one of the challenges in the world of supply chain as well. We've been doing lots of things about supply chain management in the boardroom. How do we actually get that into the boardroom? And to be quite honest, you could argue that many senior supply chain people, it's their own fault that they're not in the boardroom because they don't talk the language of the boardroom. At the end of the day, we've got to think about shareholder value. We've got to think about all sorts of issues within that to be able to make this work. And I think that's one of the key things in terms of the skill sets which are required. We've got to start using a language that is really the business language rather than our local supply chain or procurement language and so on and so forth.
Correct. And it's a mix of different skills, it's a mix of different capabilities, and it's also a mix of experiences as well. I mean, you look at some of the stuff that you guys do at Cranfield in terms of some of the advanced teaching. I think there's some really good stuff there, which is going to bring people out with a set of skills and the ability to question and really think about what some of the long-term implications might be, to think out of the box, to think about different supply models. But at the same time, you need people who've got those really good fundamental basic skills of how do you operate supply chain, or how do you put the right sourcing strategies in place. So
the way I often talk about it is that what you've always got is you've got the IQ skills of a particular role, the technical skill set of a particular role. And that is the type of stuff where if you're coming and you're looking at a particular, how do you do inventory management? How do you negotiate contracts? It's really these technical skill sets. The big thing which is making the difference now, if you like, that's the qualifier, to be quite honest. The thing which really makes the difference now is the EQ, and you could say that's the emotional intelligence, but it's actually the relational intelligence, and it's how do we manage relationships. And the definition which we've used at Cranfield for many years is that supply chain management is all about the management of relationships with all the stakeholders within the supply chain in order to reduce cost for the supply chain as a whole and increase value for the final customer. Okay, so there's our little definition. But the key thing there is the management of relationships. how do we manage relationships? If I'm managing, for example, inventory, oh, we'll have a computer system. We'll have people dedicated to it. We'll even have facilities like warehouses to store inventory and, you know, help with the management of that inventory. But if I go to many companies and I talk to them about, well, what do you have in place to manage relationships? Have you got any processes? And they look at you a bit blank. You know, what do you mean a process for managing relationships? What about infrastructure and equipment? You know, have you got anything like that to help manage relationships? What about information systems? You know, have you got any way? How does that work? And what about people? You know, the people resource for doing that as well. And often what we find is we talk about the management of relationships, but actually people don't manage them. And then they wonder why things sometimes go horribly wrong. And I think that that's where we're going to start to find a bit of a shift coming out of all this, because I would argue that even now during, you know, the COVID-19 times, those organizations which have really survived better are those which have been good at managing relationships. I think that's been one of the key things.
I think I'd just add one more thing to that point about relationships, which I agree with. See, for me, the role was already getting broader, the procurement and supply role. And it was being driven to being broader because of this much, much broader risk agenda. And the risk agenda is, yes, about understanding how you mitigate risk, but it is absolutely also about managing relationships. So to me, it's those two things. It's managing risk and it's managing relationships. I just think it's now got broader again. And I think the difference now is that more and more people appreciate just how important supply chains are to an organization, because everybody's been talking about these supply chain issues on the back of coronavirus. So look, to you and I think we've always appreciated that supply chains are important. I think many, many more people now appreciate just how important they are.
Yeah.
It's not new. It's not new. It's not new.
No, it's not.
Coronavirus has highlighted it.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, it's like I've been saying for years, you know, it's competition is not between individual companies, it's between the supply chains they are part of. And I think that that is the key thing, which all of a sudden people have started to realize. If you're thinking about your supply chain, you want your supply chain to be there and have the best partners which bring innovation and so on and so forth into the supply chain to really make this work. So it's interesting, this whole concept, because also at the moment, of course, many supply chains are dormant, and we are seeing some, I would argue, bad behaviors going on amongst some, you know, large organizations, basically saying we're not going to pay suppliers, we're not going to do this and everything else. Now that's fine, but what will then happen is you will put certain suppliers out of business, for example, right? You will break the relationship. So when things do come back and we move into the new normal, what you will find is you're going to have then a dysfunctional supply chain, which will no longer be able to compete. So we found this during, you know, 2008, during the financial crisis. Some organizations were quite brutal with their suppliers. They just said, well, we're not going to pay you, and so on and so forth. That put the suppliers out of business. Then the business came back, and hey, guess what? Those suppliers weren't going to prioritize them at all, and some of them weren't even there. So then the organizations weren't able to compete. Whereas I work with other companies who really had the vision of, they said, hey, we've got a challenge at the moment. We've got smaller suppliers who need paying quickly. We're going to make sure that we support their cash flow. But we've got some bigger ones who maybe we can extend terms with, and we'll have a conversation with them about that, because what we want to do is to enable the supply chain to remain whole and to be able to function, because we will come back from this, and when we do, we want to be the first in there so that we can start actually supplying everybody and you know, making money for the whole supply chain. So, you know, yeah.
So it's about managing risk, it's about managing relationships, and actually the more resilient your supply chain is, the easier it is to manage through that. If you've got a very unresilient supply chain, you know, a sole source from a very long way away, and then you suddenly have to turn that off, well, you're turning off your whole supply. Whereas if you have got a much more resilient supply chain, which has got a mix of suppliers, some are near shore, some are offshore, you're carrying some stock, then you've got flexibility in that supply chain because it is more resilient, and you probably then can manage that risk and manage those relationships better. But I do agree with you, Richard. All at the end of the day comes back to having the right people with the right capabilities, the right talent. And the great thing is that there are courses out there, be it some of the stuff that Cranfield does, be it some of the stuff that CIPS does, to make sure that people have the right qualifications, have the right training, and then they can go out and get that experience, which then allows them to be able to address these issues.
Yeah, and I think that this is really important because I was sort of reflecting on at the moment how essential professional organisations are. They offer so much more than just a social, a social network, as it were. And in terms of, if you like, the skills and everything else, and I think this is one of the difference. There are certain organisations where you take an exam, that's it. I've got the qualification, but it's not about that. If you think about being a professional within the supply chain industry, and I was past chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, it's about actually thinking through that you've got to have the experience as well. And in a way, that's what professional institutions are also doing. It's validating that experience. So it's not just the qualification, it's also the experience and being able to actually connect with people. And I think that's so much more than just a social network type approach. We need to complement them both. But I'll tell you now, over the last few weeks, I suddenly realised how precious my professional memberships are to me personally, because I'm able to connect with so many people. We're able to actually think through the thought leadership and everything else which is going to be required to be able to take, our individual organisations and the country out of the situation we're in the future. So it's just so important.
Great, thank you for that, Richard. And I mean, I've personally seen organisations reach out to me just this week, trying to collaborate with other organisations in their sector. There's a lot to think about, there's a lot to focus on. So CIPS has a role in bringing people together to try and come to those decisions and collaborate on what the future might look like. Well, thank you both very much for your insights today. We'll put some links in the description about where you can connect to others and all of the guidance that CIPS has on offer to help support you during these times. Thank you.